Welcome, Pete. It's great to have you here this afternoon. I'd like you to identify yourself for our viewers, and knowing that you are a member of the original Fairfield Rugby Club, tell us your story. Tell us how the club got started at Fairfield.
Okay, my pleasure. Hi there, everybody, particularly to those younger folks that don't know the history. It's pretty colorful. My name is Pete Fallon, and I was the founder of the club. And we came to Fairfield as a group of guys from all over the Eastern Seaboard, knowing there was no sports program except for basketball and, of course, baseball and soccer. We had a lot of guys who were interested in sports, had played in high school, none that were particularly great standouts, myself included. We had one particular fellow who I'll get into later on. And after we got to know each other the first year and a half, we started thinking, gee, it would be nice to have something that reflects what we all had in the American tradition of football. So we had guys like Doug Siassi, Jeff Campbell, a host of others that I could name, Don Reddington, the Mike Kellys, the John Kellys, John Sullivan, John Bender, Tom Petticord. We had, the list goes on, of a great bunch of people. And I said to them one day, where we had a core of guys, Campbell, I think, and Siassi and myself, and I said, how would you guys like to play a game like football, but without pads? And they said, ugh. I said, but you can't have a game unless you have a party afterwards. Well, that was the hooker. And I had been very fortunate because the high school I went to had a English exchange student. And on Sunday afternoons, he taught us the game of rugby. So I just simply knew the fundamentals. And when I explained it to everybody, they said, this sounds really, really good. But I emphasize that this is the only game in the world, the only game in the sports world, where 50% of the game is played on the field and 50% is played off the field. And they had the hook in by that time. So as many of you people from the 60s and 70s know, we played on a pitch where the business school, I understand, is now. And what later became known as Corbett Field, which is a story for another time with one of the other fellows, was a field that was extremely irregular. It was hardly horizontal. It had rabbit holes in it, it had a manhole cover, and it had, I think, some surveying stakes or something that was protruding through. It was a hell of a place to play. However, it gave us the home team advantage. But let me go back a little bit. We put the word out amongst the fellows who were interested that there would be a practice down at Corbett Field, and everybody was welcome who was interested in learning about rugby. And John Kenyon had not gotten involved yet, the great Scott. And we, just by ourselves, with my telling the guys what the essence of the game was, because I was no pro at all, and going by the skin of our teeth on the essentials, line outs, throwing the ball laterally, the basics, they got the hang of it, and boy, they liked it. So we got more and more organized, and we saw that we had some pretty good players, tall guys like Jeff Campbell, John Bender, John Sullivan, and one extremely good player named Doug Siassi. Doug Siassi was like a man that could turn on a dime. He could make a 90-degree turn like you wouldn't believe, and he was fast. And Doug had been an all-state halfback for the state of Connecticut. So here was a guy with much talent, a terrifically physical ability to run, who was just looking for a place to put this energy. And just imagine all these guys, testosterone, freshmen, sophomores, and no place to channel that. And it was the right fit at the right time. And I think what caught everybody's attention and everybody's fantasy to a certain extent was the fact that it was the 60s. This was a very anti-establishment game. It was a time where we were able to go ahead and utilize our testosterone in a very convivial way on the field and off the field. And it was a way to blow off a lot of tension and have fun at the same time. And so as we got better and better at it, we were working towards getting a season set up. Who would play us? So I had a lot of contacts in some of the various schools that already had rugby clubs. And this was an important thing to understand. It was never a varsity sport in any of the colleges at that time. It was always a club. And by being a club, you ran yourselves, you policed yourselves, and you always had your parties off campus. So as we got more and more organized, and I made the phone calls to various schools where I had the contacts at, and one contact led, of course, to another. Do you have an open slot this season? And you know, we're newbies at this, but we're willing to travel, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were able to put together our very, very first season. And after we had practiced down in Corbett Field, and when I say practice, we had a host of people, a host of fellows that would come down, play. Some would stay, and some would just pass on, seeing the game was not for them, but they would become rugby supporters. So there's two types of rugby people. There's ruggers and there's rugger huggers, and there's a third type, rugger supporters. So it started to gel very, very nicely. We had the talent, we were molding them together, and it was very, very rewarding. Now, we did have an obstacle, too. No uniforms and no cooperation from the school whatsoever. And that was very, very difficult. At that point, John Kenyon stepped in. I wasn't one of his students, but he came up to me and said, I understand you're trying to start a rugby club. Being the great Scot that he was very familiar with the game. So he decided to be our moderator coach. And with some of the resistance, and I'm speaking kindly here, the resistance that we got from the school, he was very, very helpful. You've got to remember that back at that time, there were only 2 or 3 sports, and basketball was king. Anything that took away from attendance or a concentration on basketball was not really appreciated by the administration. So we not only were getting people interested in the game, we were getting supporters, and then we were getting the partiers. So it kind of went across the board, and as we gelled and got together, we put together a selection committee. And John Kenyon had run interference for us with the school, and so we were allowed to go ahead and use Corbett Field, because we had just simply met down there without any notification to or from the administration. And as it grew, he helped us out considerably. So we had a next problem of uniforms. And we had an awful time trying to get uniforms. And the athletic department did not want us to use these short little skivvies that the track members use. So we begged, we borrowed, we appropriated. We never stole. We appropriated some uniforms. And so initially our first uniforms, really while we were scrimmaging, were just Fairfield University t-shirts, sweatshirts, and then the little shorts. For our first game, we didn't really have any uniforms more than that. And that was with Fordham. And we got invited to play Fordham's B team, which any team for us at that point would have been not only a great test of our skills, but a great welcome to play anybody. So it worked out very, very nicely. We got down to Fordham for our first game, and I'll never forget it. And the one thing I love about it was that I was able to score the winning point. So for a team that I started and taken a lot of flack from, it was worth it to be able to put that point forward. And I got to commend a young man named Ken Waters. Ken Waters was our kicker, terribly better than me. To this day, I cannot remember why I was meant to kick the point, but to me it was payback. So I'll never forget it. But from that point we played a couple other teams. I think I can't remember which ones, but then we heard about a thing called the Seven-A-Sides, the Sevens, down at Van Cortlandt Park in New York City. And I don't know how many of the people listening to this know Van Cortlandt Park, but it was a pain in the knees, as well as other places. It was absolutely hard packed dirt. Grass hadn't seen it for years, and there were bottle caps in it, there were pieces of glass and shards, and it was November. And so most of us skipped Thanksgiving with our families that time. And we got down there, nobody had ever heard of Fairfield. Nobody. even well, Fairfield basketball, no, Fairfield, no. And so all the heavies of the Sevens were down there. And all the guys I'm talking to now, you know what the Seven-A-Sides are. And it was the first time we ever played, so we selected the guys who were going to play, and it was absolutely brutal. It was very, very cold, and our knees were getting killed, and we ended up through the trials of the positioning of the teams, ending up becoming second. And we came in second, and the only team that beat us were the Old Blues.
Wow.
From Columbia. And they had been playing for years. And the Old Blues essentially were a collection of former football players from Columbia University. And their best player was a guy named Donnelly. And his father, Buff Donnelly, was the Columbia football coach. And Donnelly was a big guy. And we all took some lumps, but he went home with a black eye. So, there was retribution after all. So that really put us on the map. We were even written up in the New York Times, which was totally incredible. That was the ego booster that we needed. And I cannot remember some of the other teams. Oh, we did play Harvard Business School, which was interesting. And as I mentioned, all the guys that came to rugby had football backgrounds, whether they were average football players or stars like Doug Siassi. They were familiar, as most Americans were. That was our heritage. And in football, you pound and ground pound, and you hit and tackle. In rugby, the way to gain yardage, which we really were having trouble with, trying to curve our football talents, was to kick the ball. And as it goes off sides, that's where the next line out is. And Kenyon, the great Scott, was always banging on us to kick the ball, kick the ball. Make a long story short, we ended up at Harvard Business School. I got a game set up there. And the B school guys were all made up mainly of foreign students, the UK, France, Germany. They were really, from our point of view, virtually professional ruggers. And they only beat us by, I think, 2 points. We really gave them a run for our money because we had speed with Siassi. But the French guy, I spoke French, and the French fella, after the game, they gave us a good party. And after the game, we were talking with the French guy. He said, "You guys really have got to learn how to play rugby by kicking. That's European rugby." So I took that to be a good lesson. And when we came back, and in the following season, I said, "This is how we got to go ahead and do this." And we finished out the season with a winning season, from what I recall, with tremendous joy from that Seven-A-Sides and recognition from around the Eastern Seaboard and the Eastern Rugby Union, which was headed up by a man named Ed Lee. And he saw us as kind of a Cinderella team with a great potential. And as the head of the Rugby Union, he was always anxious to see a new team form, and so we were his baby in a way. Our second season was the spring of 63 or 64, I forget which. So our second season, anyways, was far better scheduled. We played Brown, and the seasons down there, I can't remember the teams, but the business school we played again. But Brown was a real pain. For some reason or other, we went up to Brown, and it was a cold day, and Dan Gaddy, who was a fabulous player, ran into the goalpost, broke his nose. there was blood all over the place. He continued to play because there are no substitutions allowed. I think we beat Brown, and they refused to give us a party afterwards. So we dropped him off the schedule for a game or two, or I mean a season or two. And it's just a no-no. And I was talking with Chris Groward last night and some of the other ruggers at Billy Conley's induction to the Hall of Fame. And I said, do you guys ever remember a fight on the field those first few seasons, like in a hockey match or a baseball game? And none of us could ever remember one, because you're pummeling each other on the field to begin with. And then you're shaking hands afterwards and you're quaffing some beers, you know, afterwards. So that's how we got started, with the tapping into the testosterone and putting something on the campus that went across the board of a sport and a camaraderie and a party afterwards.
That's an incredible story. One thing that I would like you to talk a little bit more about is you mentioned Doug Siassi, but if you could just tell us a little bit more about what made him so special and his legacy.
Doug was a terrific guy, and they don't come any better sports-wise. And plus, he was a good man, too. But Doug had this incredible capacity where he was low to the ground. He was built like a rock. Wasn't that heavy, but he was built very, very well, low to the ground, and he was pigeon-toed. And it's come out through athletic science. Pigeon-toed people can turn quicker. I'm not pigeon-toed, but they can turn quicker without hurting their anterior cruciate ligament. And this kid could turn on a dime. Al Sullivan was a smaller player too. He could do the same thing too. So we had a couple really, really good runners, and most of us were just pretty much average. And you know, we handled the scrum. We had a great hooker in John Swanhouse. Swanee was incredible. We had a great lock with Jeff Campbell, a good line. I mean, the guys that I mentioned before, I'm sure I left some out. Tom Petticord was one of the fellas, and he was just a stalwart. And we just had a bunch of guys that really had started to mesh and pull together on a concept and a playing mentality and a camaraderie, knowing there was always beer at the end of the game. And I was very fortunate because a lot of women would start to come to the games, and I had my high school sweetheart with me who went to New Rochelle, who came up for every single game except the Brown game, which I'm glad that she didn't come because she didn't miss the party. So, but my wife June is still with me today, so I'd love to call her. She is the prime rugger hugger. She saw every game except that Brown one.
Pete, did you ever think that the club would last for 50 years and still be going strong?
That is an incredibly good question. I've given that a lot of thought. And in our innocence and in our ignorance of not really knowing fully what we were doing, there was no way that I had any idea it would arrive at what it's arrived at, any more than Jeff Campbell knew he was going to be president of Burger King, or John Swanhouse was going to be vice president of Pepsi-Cola. We didn't have these grandiose ideas. We just wanted to play, have fun, and drink beer, and have the camaraderie together. So I don't think there's one of us that had any idea. And I am absolutely blown away by what has occurred. I've been out of the loop for a long, long time, and I was overseas many years and weren't able to follow anything afterwards. And because I switched to pre-med, I had to stop playing even while I was at there. So I had to have an abrupt closure and start getting down to work. But at any rate, no, to answer the question, I don't think any of us had any idea. And to see what it's grown into and evolved into, and with the upcoming 50th, this is incredible.
I mean, the club has had a huge impact, positive impact, on so many young men and now women. And as the person who is now being referred to as the father or the George Washington of the club, how does that make you feel to know that sort of serendipitous creation of the Fairfield Rugby Club, you know,
well, it's very
has
interesting.
this legacy?
Last night at the Billy Connolly induction, Billy came up to me and he said, you know, you were not only the George Washington, but you were the Johnny Appleseed. And that's a very, very nice thing to say. And I'd like to say that, you know, maybe I started it, but we had so many people that were following through with it, helping us out, working together. And again, there's no I in the word team. And I think the initial 2 seasons that we had showed that. Because we actually had to have we had to start with who's going to play. So we had to appoint ourselves kind of a selection committee. And to the best of my recollection, it was myself and Doug Siassi and Jeff Campbell and maybe 1 or 2 others, Bob Sullivan, to see who had shown up for most of the scrimmages, who had shown up for the practices, and who really was a combination of deserving to play because they were there, and who had the talent so we could perhaps win a game. And it was all a joint effort, and there's no I in the word team, and that's we were a good team, well put together, so, and lucky too. So.
It's a great story. Any other thoughts or comments you'd like
well,
to share?
Just to go back to what you were saying, to think that it has evolved into a 50th reunion, where I'm told last night there's going to be over 1,000 people there in October, makes me extremely proud. I cannot tell you what that makes me feel good as, but it was not a one-man job. It really was. I may have been the first captain and the founder, but then a better player than me became captain. That was Doug, and he deserved it more than anything. And when we went from that, we realized we had to start forming a organization that had some leadership in the administrative, and because I had to handle everything, the uniforms, which was a great story, but setting the games up, a matchmaker, et cetera, et cetera. So then that's how we came to have, I think, Frank Quinn was elected first president, and that was the administrative type of things we started to do, and we followed the model of all the other schools that had the administration like that, president and captain, etc. So it was a wonderful learning experience. To know that I took part in it was very, very rewarding, but to see what it has grown into it has been an incredible payback. It really has been. So I spoke with the president last night, introduced myself, Father Von Axe, and I went up and I said, Father, you don't know me, but I'm the culprit that started the whole thing, and Father McGinnis and I weren't too close friends. And I said, I'm so glad to see that there's so much support of not only the rugby team now, but all the people that you have in other sports as well. So the school and the club have very, very synergetically come a long, long way. And he took it very, very well. It was a backhanded compliment, but I don't want to let it go that the school did not support us in the beginning. We had to fight for everything that we had, and it was worth it.